Welcome to What to Do When, a podcast from real lawyers with real perspective, where we explore a variety of legal issues and scenarios. Each week, we focus on a new topic and discuss what to do when and if any of these legal scenarios ever happen to you or a loved one. With over 40 years of combined legal experience, our hosts offer their unique perspectives and insights on a range of real-life legal situations.
Hi, welcome back to the podcast here at Critzer Cardani in Richmond, Virginia. What to do when?
Jackie, what's on the docket for today?
Okay, now it sounds a little weird. That definitely wasn't Scott sitting next to me. Today's docket is what to do when there's high conflict in your case. Scott's here in the room with us, but this is Dr. Jill Gasper. She's joining us as a guest today. And we're going to start with an introduction of Dr. Gasper. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, where you went to school, how long you've been in practice?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Jill Gasper. I was born and raised a Bostonian, so that is where I grew up. So I am a Yankee, and though not a Yankees fan, that is unacceptable in Boston. I'm a Red Sox fan. And I went to undergrad at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and then I have been down here in Richmond since 2001. Came down to do my graduate work. So I got my master's and my PhD at VCU in child clinical psychology. And I did my predoctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Virginia Treatment Center for Children, which is the child psychiatry hospital within VCU Medical Center. And I've been in private practice ever since then. So it's been about 13 years now. And I have an office in the near West End.
Interesting. So I often, and I think a lot of the practitioners, family law practitioners in Richmond, encounter you in co-parenting counseling or maybe some sort of facilitating of court cases. But what is your practice all about? Who do you see? Do you see children or adolescents, or is it primarily adults in co-parenting situations?
I would say it is largely child-focused, though my clients in the room are not always necessarily children. So I have a very small percentage of adult therapy cases, probably like 5%. And I would say about half of the rest of that is co-parenting counseling. So that's where I actually have mom and dad in my office, but we are exclusively focused on children. And then the remainder would be children and adolescents. And I'd say the youngest I've ever had is probably a very verbal 4-year-old. I've had a couple of those, but usually 5 on up.
Wow.
So if you're engaging a client, 2 parents, about their children and you see they need therapy, do you kind of tell them that they need to be seeing a counselor on their own? Is that how you
For individual therapy, if I'm doing co-parenting? Yes, I do. Sometimes, a lot of times folks come to me with therapists. So that gets a little more complicated. Yeah.
So when we did the introduction, we're talking about high conflict cases. We're not talking about children who have high conflict. We're really talking about the co-parenting relationship and when there's high conflict in the co-parenting relationship. And I think it's easy for most people who are going through custody battles, not always divorced, right? They're not always married or haven't always been married to each other. Sometimes it's just an unmarried couple with a child. There's obviously conflict because they're not in the relationship together anymore. But is there a difference between regular, okay, now we're not together anymore conflict versus this term high conflict case?
Yes, absolutely. When we use the term high conflict, we're really talking about conflict about the child or children. We're often talking about involving the children in that conflict in some way and triangulating them. We are sometimes talking about actually having the conflict right in front of the children. Sometimes it may be more of a nonverbal, and the kids have understood the memo that my parents are not friends. They're just enemies. And I've had kids use those words. So if you think about all of the divorces that occur, about a quarter of those are pretty friendly divorces. Maybe you're kind of Gwyneth Paltrow, Chris Martin, conscious uncoupling kind of folks. But another quarter, so just as many, are what we would consider high conflict. And so Of those, I think folks are variable in when they're using the term high conflict, but it's mostly that top quarter.
Okay.
And then even the top 10% of those are litigating a lot, and in the top like 2 to 5% are considered just incessant litigators. But ones that you need multiple bank boxes to hold your files for, and they're going to be in court till that kid is 18.
So many questions about that. Well, let's start at that far end, that highest conflict, multiple bankers boxes. I mean, Scott and I both have cases like that. We've seen other cases go into court like that, and have certainly been a part of cases like that. What is your experience in those cases on how that high conflict impacts the children in that relationship?
Horribly. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, right? That there's just this chronic litigation. Because if you look at the divorce cycle, it's roughly a 5-year just misery. If you look at, which starts before the actual separation, the marriage or relationship is declining, and often the children are there experiencing that, the actual separation, and then the eventual picking up and return to baseline after, right? After that grief and anger and whatnot is worked through. So that is the normative process. So something like 2.5 years after a separation, things should be resuming in terms of parents' moods and stability and whatnot. And in these families, that stability never returns. And so kids don't, it's one thing to ride through a storm. It's different if the storm is just never lifting.
And so do you see behavioral issues, discipline issues, legal issues for these kids who eventually become teenagers, or what sort of, is it just mental health? Do they develop maybe some sort of mental health issues? Is it all of the above?
I think it's all of the above.
But the short answer is it does have an impact. It's not it might. It does have an impact on the children, and not a good one. That's really interesting. So what would you say? So here we are in a high conflict case. You said they're talking about the children, and the conflict revolves around the children. So this isn't the divorce stuff. This isn't equitable distribution and money. Usually, it's more about what the parenting time.
It's often about parenting time. It can be about things that other families just navigate very smoothly, like, hey, I'm going to be leaving for a trip and I'd like to hit the road early. Do you think that, Bobby could sleep over the night before? And another family would say, shh. In an amicable family, they'd say, sure, I'd like him to be able to just kind of sleep and go. That's great. No problem.
Okay.
What works for you? And in these families, there's just no flexibility for just normal adjustments that need to be made to meet a kid's needs.
Do you see that as a power struggle between the parents normally?
Absolutely. I think there's a power struggle. I think especially when you have one parent who has a lot less time, there's going to be there's just that time is a hot commodity. And so that person who has less of the pie is not going to want to give up a crumb. And
when you're dealing with these high conflict cases, do you often see that one or both have secondary mental health issues or personality disorders, or maybe not really? They're just maybe cemented in how much time they want to spend with their child or children.
We certainly see a higher preponderance of mental health disorders in this population, absolutely. But as you probably have seen in our cases where folks get custody evaluations, plenty of them result in no significant mental health diagnosis. It's more personality traits that are very problematic. And I would say that rigidity is a huge one. That's a real marker of a high conflict family.
We have another local doctor who just sees psychologists who sees or did see, not anymore, Dr. Michelle Nelson. And one thing she mentioned, and I know you're familiar with her, was that this custody conflict is just about the worst time in a person's life. And so it brings out all of the worst parts of their mental health and their personality. And so how do you help families get out of that it almost in my mind is a ditch, right? They're just sort of dug in, and if we can just get them to come up here and sort of see it differently. I mean, Scott and I have been doing this a long time. You've been doing this a long time. Sometimes it feels like the answer is so clear. But for these families who are so entrenched in their position, how do you help them navigate through out of the high conflict when it's possible?
Yeah. I think the thing that helps the most is using the children as a beacon of you have to realize this is not, as you said earlier, whether or not your kids are going to have difficulties. It's just when and how significant they're going to be. And you have so much control to put this train back on the tracks. And we can go to court all day, but the judge is not going to make your children healthier. Like, the real change comes with the parents. I think the other piece when people really have any kind of transformation in co-parenting is when they really put the mirror up to themselves. These folks can tell me all day what the other parent is doing wrong, and probably with pretty good accuracy, but that's not going to fix it. They have to be able to see what they're doing to contribute to the problem, because most of the time both parents are contributing pretty significantly. I do, though, have some cases where it really is pretty lopsided, and I've got a very reasonable parent and a very unreasonable parent they're having to deal with.
And so in those situations, let's see, you've been called as a witness into court as the co-parenting counselor, and you've got the one parent who is the mostly bad actor, and you've got the one parent who's the mostly good actor. The attorney is obviously in an adversarial position and trying to get you to throw the bad parent under the bus, and they've agreed to things and not done them or whatever they've done. And I would guess then my perspective is always that you as the professional trying to maintain somewhat neutral position, because these people but they're both your clients. But when you go to court and you've got such a lopsided evaluation of these parties, how do you best present that information to the court?
Sure. I'm always looking for the strengths and weaknesses in both, right? So even when it's very lopsided, I always see the strengths in that parent, even when they make some pretty miserable mistakes. I think another piece is I tell families pretty much immediately that part of why we don't use health insurance is complicated in terms of who's the client for co-parenting, right? So when you use traditional health insurance, you have an identified patient and you give that person a diagnosis and you're treating that diagnosis. And in co-parenting, you're seeing both parents, so the file cannot belong to just one of them, and you're not diagnosing them, and you're not treating that diagnosis. You might have some assessment, but you're not going to share that necessarily. And so what I tell them is that what's really, my client is actually your children's best interests. You're the one sitting in my office, but really that's my client. So I'm going to say things that you might not find to be particularly favorable. But I think the other piece, so I'm always looking for those strengths and weaknesses, but I'm also never testifying about something the client has not heard in the room.
Okay.
And so I'm pretty transparent all the way through. And so they would never for the first time hear that I thought they were more of the problem than the other. And again, I still think that's the rarity where it's so lopsided. I think usually attorneys, if they're asking if they want me to testify, they're basically assessing, okay, she's going to say some terrible things about my client, but is she going to say enough good, or is the bad about the other client worse that it's worth me calling her? And I think that's really, I don't know, maybe that you two of you could tell me, but that's what I hear attorneys thinking out loud as they're deciding whether they want to call me, because it's rarely rosy about one person and muddy about the other.
Well,
can I go to another perspective? Because
sure.
I think this is important. I think in a lot of high conflict cases, one parent may have a strong view about how the child is to be raised, religiously, educationally, whatever that may be. The other parent seemingly has kind of gone along with whatever for most of the marriage, and now that the divorce presents itself. And my question is this, trying to put a little context to it, but my question is, what do you see as worse? The one parent conceding her way of doing things and what she believed was the right way to raise the child, so there's less conflict, or these high conflicts where it's like, no, we set this boundary, we're going to do it this way. I see that, especially as a guardian light. I've been doing that for over 20 years, almost 25 years. I see that as always seems to be a problem. They're my children. We agreed to raise them this way. And then the conflict really comes in the one parent's inability to let go of some of the way they want to raise them. And my point is, what's worse for the child, giving that up or the high conflict that they're in?
I think the conflict is worse most of the time. I mean, unless, there's something dangerous or particularly unhealthy that you're trying to reverse, right? So sometimes I have things that they're trying to recreate that are going to be very difficult. Like I'll do something more innocuous, like screen time, that it was not their preference for it to be a free-for-all, but it became a free-for-all, and they signed on for screen time with their kids being a free-for-all for the last 5 years, and now they want to change it. Mm-hmm. I would certainly advocate for a parent to pursue that, but it's not going to stick if they don't both do it. They can do their best to exercise that in their own home, but you have to recognize you set the course with the kids already, and so it would depend on age and whatnot. But things like religion, trying to make a change. I mean, I think we try to respect that both parents have rights here. And so I see lots of kids who are raised in multi-faiths. And so I personally, in co-parenting, take the stance of the more the merrier. And you can introduce your child to your own faith in your time. But you've got to keep in mind, if we're talking about a 14-year-old, they might not really be down for that in the same sort of way a 7-year-old would be. And you need to respect the other parent still. I've had more times than I want to count folks who like baptize children without the other parent's knowledge, things like that are, that to me is very problematic.
Even in the situation where they were raised in a church or religion, if you will, where baptism is sort of a normal thing for that coming of age or whenever this child decides, but the divorce occurs or separation occurs prior to the baptism, it really, what I'm hearing you say is it's important because the child was raised in that. But if you aren't communicating with that parent and getting them on board, going ahead and doing it absent their, permission, it's not just their knowledge. It's not enough for them to know about it. But if you just act out of, well, I'm just going to do it because that's the way we've raised this child, that you're part of the problem.
Absolutely. I think that you need to share that information. And we might come to the conclusion that maybe the other person doesn't agree, but there has been this history within this particular faith, and maybe the child very clearly wants to do it. And I might support that anyway, but I would also support that you need to invite the other parent and the extended family, and we need to try to make it work.
Part of the divorce process or separation process or whatever the parent relationship was that no longer is understanding that you very likely are going to raise the child or children differently than when the family was intact. And I think that probably, if people could come to that understanding, Scott and I would have half our caseload, probably.
Yeah, I tell my families, I think the motto of co-parenting is different is not bad. That actually your children benefit from that. That we know from studying human bonding that opposites attract. That's literally a fact. But that same thing that you thought completed you then despise. That thing that is so different, and now it's foreign and alien, and I want nothing to do with it. But kids, that benefits them greatly to have these very different experiences, but with both of their parents, and it prepares them for the world around them, because the world around them is not just mom personality or not just dad personality. And so if they can understand that, that is a huge component of being able to be a cooperative co-parent, recognizing the value that your co-parent adds.
Well, from a parenting perspective, or even a practitioner, whether it's another mental health professional or a legal professional, how do people figure out whether they have a high conflict case? Is there sort of a top 3? If these things are going on, you probably have a high conflict case and proceed down that path? Or how do people figure that out?
Meaning the clinician or the attorney or the client recognizing that it's a high conflict
before
case?
They come to you. So the attorney and or the clients, maybe the parents haven't even met with attorneys yet, or maybe they're with an attorney that wouldn't necessarily recognize high conflict. How do people recognize when they're in a high conflict situation?
I think that unfortunately, probably Dr. Google plays a role in that to an extent, right? Of folks looking at what the symptoms are of a high conflict situation and feeling like they're checking those boxes. I think some degree of it is from, just talking with friends and family. I think when folks come to an attorney, I'm hoping that most attorneys are giving them the full range of options available to them in terms of mediation and collaborative divorce and litigation, and so that they're considering the options. I think a lot of people say they don't want to be litigating, and yet they are. But they will tell you, but that's because I have to because of my co-parent here.
Yes.
So, certainly I think you're in a high conflict situation when you're dealing with like a known substance use disorder potentially. Although we can have that present in other cases as well, right? But certainly abuse scenarios. And of course, when we use the word abuse, we could be talking about physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, right? I think the difficulty is that we all have a different threshold for when we throw that word around.
Sure.
And so that's a big piece of it. But it's really a lack of being willing to have compromise. So again, that rigidity, I think, is the biggest hallmark.
And when people are then in or think they are, or the attorneys think they are in a high conflict case, and they go looking for a high conflict professional to assist, is that key term, high conflict resolution or something like that? Is that something they should be searching for? Does it matter if I feel like I know the answer, but in your mind, does it matter if the person is necessarily trained in high conflict? Are all mental health professionals trained in high conflict?
They are not all trained in high conflict. So I would say our primary professional organization is AFCC, that folks who are well trained in high conflict dynamics might belong to, or at least have completed trainings with. So that is the Association for Family and Conciliation Courts. And it is an international organization that includes mental health professionals, attorneys, and judges. And that has just been a great resource. We should have training in a little bit of awareness of family law. So even though I'm a psychologist, sometimes I'll have parents come in that are attorneys, but they are not family law attorneys. And I feel sometimes like I might know more about how this works at this point. So I think you need to have some knowledge of that. You need to have training in child psychopathology and child development, adult psychopathology, family therapy, communication and mediation skills training. Sort of all of that is really what you should be looking for in a professional. And I will say, especially child clinicians. I think child clinicians are wonderful and seek to serve the children, right, and to honor their voices, but can easily get lost in advocating for their client versus what might be in their client's best interest. And so a lot of times folks are not well versed in, what do I do about a subpoena? And what do I do when just the mom has brought this kid for therapy and the dad doesn't even know I exist? Should I be seeing this child? And so I think it's really important that folks have a respect for separated families and the importance of including both parents in a child's care. So that's I'm speaking more about being the child therapist in a divorce situation, but a huge percentage of kids whose parents are separating go even preventatively to a clinician. So that's going to be more people, not just the high conflict people.
Well, and not to throw myself in the mix, but years ago, more than 10 years ago when I first separated, my children were little. They were 3 and 4, almost 5. And I love the word preventative. That's really little to be seeing anyone.
Sure.
But I thought, well, let's just make sure they're okay. I just want to see how they're doing. And so they did some play therapy. And this is a really quick and short, funny story. My daughter was 3.5, and she'd had her play therapy session. And then the counselor came out and she said, well, I want to talk to you about something. And I said, okay. She said, your daughter was playing with a coffin, like a a little wooden coffin in the sand tray. I said, okay. And so I brought my daughter in and I said, what is that? She said, it's a treasure chest. There you go. She's not fascinated by death and dead people in coffins. She thinks it's a treasure chest like you would find in a fish tank. So,
yes, those are the risks of overinterpretation.
Imagine that.
But just being aware that even just little things, it's not always gospel truth, and sometimes context and perspective is certainly important in all of that.
Yes.
All right. So as we bring this particular topic to a close, what is it that a legal team can do, or parents involved in the legal system? What can we all do together to help reduce conflict? And I'd like to focus particularly on legal practitioners in this process, because some of us are more
Rigid
is a good word. More inclined to push towards conflict because it's higher billable time. And I hate to say that about some of our colleagues in Richmond, but I think we see it not here, but across the board, everywhere. There are people who are going to push for the more conflict. It just generates more money for them in a billable sense. But what can we do, like Scott and I, who don't push the high conflict, who try to resolve things even outside of court? I mean, we're always trying to resolve without the necessity of going to court.
I think client control is really important for attorneys. And so, being aware of missteps your clients might be taking, giving them good advice to rein that in. I think being realistic with your clients about what they can realistically expect to get as an outcome, because I think you probably have a good sense. So, for example, I had a mom come to me, expecting that the dad was going to have, 4 hours a week of visitation, something like that, like 2-hour stints. And I mean, I need an attorney to let that person know, no, that's not going to happen. Like that's not the bottom that we work with. And so I think that's really important. I think, again, using that same beacon, I know many of you are parents as well, to be able to try to help them recognize what's going to help get things back on track, and for that parent to start rebuilding their life and to pull the child out of any conflict that's there. I think also there's a local attorney in town who I think is really good at asking, like, is this the hill you want to die on? Is this the one? To just help prioritize. I think that helps get to a settlement as well.
Got it. Well, we have other topics that we want to explore with Dr. Gasper, so please stay tuned. But in summary today, high conflict. The most important thing, really, parents, practitioners, anyone, is that real change doesn't come because the court orders it. It comes because the parents reflect upon their own behavior and realize that they need to make the change to reduce the conflict, not because they care so much about the other parent, although that'd be nice, but because they love their children so much that they want to see the children become well-adjusted members of society instead of the result of high conflict, forever litigation. The second takeaway is that when you're dealing with a co-parenting counselor and you're going to court, you really ought to be considering the strengths and the weaknesses both of yourself and the other co-parent. Unlikely is it going to be where a co-parenting counselor comes and says, this parent is great and this parent is terrible. So be aware that your weaknesses are going to be exposed in this process too. So do your best, again, to reflect and make some of those changes on your own as you're going through this process. And finally, I would say for the practitioners in the cases is maintain client control and set some realistic expectations about what could be the possible outcome of the custody litigation. Not the bottom 4 hours a week and not necessarily shared custody either, or primary physical custody, but what are the realistic expectations in your given case. So be sure and stay tuned for our next episode where we talk about parental alienation with Dr. Gasper.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of What to Do When. For more episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, and we encourage you to check our archives to listen to previous topics. Tune in next week for a new episode and some fresh perspective from Critzer Cardani.